This is the moment the most powerful club in the world broke apart, not slowly, not over months of diplomatic tension and back-channel arguments. It broke in a single morning in a single hallway in front of cameras that caught every second of it. And the man who broke it was not an outsider. He was sitting at the head of the table. 1 hour ago, 5 of the world's most influential leaders stood up from their chairs, picked up their folders, and walked out of a G7 working session while it was still in progress. France walked, Germany walked, Japan walked, Italy walked, and then the United Kingdom, America's oldest and closest strategic partner, the country that has stood shoulder to shoulder with Washington through every war, every crisis, and every global emergency since 1945, walked too. The table they left behind had 7 seats. 2 of those seats had already been denied to Canada. That left one man sitting alone in a room built for the most powerful alliance on earth, staring at 6 empty chairs while the cameras kept rolling. In this breakdown, we are going to take you through exactly what happened this morning, why 5 leaders made the decision that will define the next decade of global politics, what was said in private before any of this became public, and what the financial markets, foreign capitals, and Washington's own inner circle are saying right now. Because this is not just a diplomatic incident. This is the visible, documented, on-camera collapse of American leadership in the one institution where that leadership was supposed to be unquestioned. To understand why this morning happened, you have to go back 24 hours. The G7 summit was being held at a coastal conference retreat, the kind of setting chosen specifically to project calm, cooperation, and shared purpose. Leaders arrived the evening before the formal sessions. There were handshakes on the steps, bilateral conversations in the corridors, the traditional leaders' dinner where the real conversations always happen away from the press pool, supply chain resilience, a shared statement on global financial stability, the kind of agenda that does not make headlines but keeps the global economy running. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney arrived with a full delegation and a detailed brief. His team had prepared position papers on 3 of the 4 agenda items. There was nothing unusual about the evening. Nothing that suggested the next morning would be remembered for 100 years. But behind the dinner table, something else was happening. According to sources familiar with the conversations that took place during that first evening, the American delegation had been working a very different agenda, not the public one, the private one. The goal, as one senior official described it to a European outlet, was to build enough support among the other 5 leaders to formally sideline Canada from the following morning's working session. The argument being made was that Canada's current trade positioning was making productive G7 discussion impossible. White House did not expect. The French president, approached during a pre-dinner reception, reportedly gave a single-sentence response that stopped the conversation cold. He said the G7 does not operate as a reward system. The Japanese prime minister, approached separately, gave a polite and firm refusal. The UK's prime minister pointed out that any change to G7 participation required the agreement of all members. 3 separate conversations, 3 clear answers. The answer was no. That should have been the end of it. In any normal diplomatic environment, when you ask permission and 3 people tell you no, you accept the result and you move on. You adjust your approach. You find another way. That is how alliances are maintained. That is how trust is built. But what happened instead at precisely 8:47 in the morning was that 2 American security officials positioned themselves outside the door of the working session room and told the Canadian delegation that the Prime Minister would not be entering. No paperwork, no mechanism, no process invoked, just a physical barrier and a message. Mark Carney and his team stood in the corridor outside a glass-walled conference room and watched the session begin without them. Inside the room, the American president addressed the 5 remaining leaders directly. The press pool microphones were active. What he said next will be quoted in diplomatic history courses for the rest of this century. He said that Canada was not participating because Canada had not been a productive member of the group. He said the United States built this table. He said America decides who sits at it. Read that again. The President of the United States looked at the leaders of France, Germany, Japan, Italy, and the United Kingdom and told them that their seats at the G7 exist because America permits them, not because of their nation's economies, their democratic values, their decades of contribution to Western cooperation, because America permits it. And while those words were settling into the room, filling the silence in a way that no one had prepared for, 2 other things were happening simultaneously. Outside the glass wall, the Canadian delegation was still standing in the corridor, visible to every camera in the room, and in the delegations of each of the 5 seated nations, aides were rapidly sending encrypted messages back to their capitals, describing exactly what had just been said. The French president was the first to move. He did not raise his hand. He did not ask to speak. He simply placed both palms flat on the table, pushed back his chair, and stood. The room went completely still. When he spoke to the other 4 leaders, not to the American president. He said that a table where any member can be removed by another is not a table of equals. He said he had not traveled to this summit to hold a seat that belonged to someone else's permission. Then he walked to the door. While the French president was still crossing the room, Germany's chancellor was already on her feet. She gathered her documents with the kind of deliberate calm that communicates far more than urgency ever could, and she followed without a word. Her entire delegation, 12 officials seated along the back wall, rose at the same moment. That kind of coordinated movement does not happen by accident. Berlin had already made its decision before the session began. Japan's prime minister stood 4 seconds later. At the door, he turned and offered a brief formal bow toward the room. It was a gesture of Japanese protocol, but in that moment, in that context, it read as something closer to a final goodbye to an institution that had just changed forever. Italy's prime minister followed, pausing briefly with one hand resting on the table's edge, as if he was taking a moment with something he had valued and was now leaving behind. And then the United Kingdom's prime minister stood. Of all the departures, his carried the most weight, because the special relationship between Britain and the United States is not just a diplomatic phrase. It is woven into military treaties, intelligence agreements, cultural history, and 80 years of strategic alignment. When the UK's prime minister looked across the table before walking out, every camera in the room captured that silence. That look contained a calculation that took decades to build and seconds to conclude. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. That is how long it took for 5 of the 7 G7 nations to vacate a room that the United States president had just claimed as American property. While those 5 leaders walked, the financial markets were already moving. The dollar weakened against a basket of major currencies within 18 minutes of the first reports emerging. European bond yields shifted. Trading desks at 3 major investment banks halted routine operations to assess exposure. A currency strategist at a major Frankfurt-based institution sent a client note at 9:31 that morning containing one sentence: "The institutional risk premium on American-led economic frameworks just became a real number." The 5 leaders did not go to their separate rooms. They gathered in the corridor outside the session, the same corridor where the Canadian delegation had been standing. Every camera still positioned inside the glass-walled room had a clear line of sight. 6 leaders, 5 who had just walked out and 1 who had been barred from entering, standing together in animated, warm conversation. Handshakes, eye contact. The body language of people who had just made a shared decision and understood exactly what it meant. A journalist asked Carney what he wanted to say. He looked at the 5 leaders around him and said, "They are the story today." Then he physically stepped to the side of the group, removing himself from the visual center, letting the 5 leaders take the frame. It was a precise and powerful act of political communication. The man who had been humiliated was refusing to perform victimhood. The 5 who had sacrificed their seats were the ones the world needed to see. The French president's calculation was the simplest and the most profound. If an American president can remove a G7 member unilaterally, and the remaining members accept that removal by staying seated, then the precedent is set. The next removal becomes easier. The one after that easier still. France's seat at the G7 is not guaranteed by French power alone. It is guaranteed by the principle that membership is equal and protected. The moment that principle was violated and accepted, France's own security at the table would begin to erode. He was not defending Canada. He was defending the legal and moral architecture that protects every member, including his own. Germany's calculation was institutional. Berlin's entire post-war foreign policy is built on the idea that multilateral structures prevent the kind of unilateral power that Europe suffered through twice in the 20th century. When the American president said, "This is our table," he was not just making a claim about the G7. He was demonstrating a governing philosophy that Germany has spent 80 years building institutions specifically to constrain. The chancellor did not need to deliberate. Her entire political formation had already given her the answer. Japan's calculation was strategic. Japan exists in one of the most complex security environments on Earth. surrounded by nuclear-armed neighbors, dependent on American military guarantees, and deeply invested in the rules-based international order as a framework that constrains larger powers. When a senior American official told Japanese diplomats the previous evening that America expected Japan's cooperation on the Canada exclusion, the response was polite and negative. Japan's prime minister understood that accepting this precedent would not strengthen the American alliance. It would weaken every multilateral structure that Japan depends on to navigate a dangerous neighborhood. The UK's calculation was the hardest and the most consequential. Britain's special relationship with the United States is not an abstraction. It is built into real security agreements, real intelligence sharing, real military cooperation. Walking away from an American president in a public forum is not something British prime ministers do lightly, but sources close to the British delegation say the prime minister's view was clear. The special relationship derives its value from being a relationship between equals who share values. The moment Britain accepted that one partner could unilaterally remove others from multilateral forums, the relationship would no longer be between equals. It would be a different kind of relationship entirely, and not one that served British interests or British values. Reports from inside multiple delegations describe the American side as caught genuinely off guard by the speed and totality of the walkout. Senior White House staff had modeled a scenario where one or two leaders might express concern or abstain from participation in certain sessions. They had not modeled a scenario where 5 leaders departed simultaneously and then stood in a publicly visible corridor forming a visible counter-coalition. Sources in 2 European capitals described frantic calls between American officials and their counterparts in the 30 minutes following the walkout, calls in which the American side repeatedly asked whether this was a coordinated action and received the same answer each time. It was not coordinated, it was independent. And that was the most alarming part. 5 leaders, 5 different national interests, 5 different political calculations, all arriving at the same conclusion without coordinating it in advance. That is not a protest, that is a verdict. The joint statement that emerged from the 6 leaders within 4 hours of the walkout was precise and deliberate in its language. It affirmed the principle of sovereign equality as the foundation of multilateral institutions. It stated clearly that no member of the G7 holds authority over the participation of any other member. It was signed by France, Germany, Japan, Italy, the United Kingdom, and Canada. The United States was not invited to sign. Markets did not wait for political analysis. By early afternoon, 3 major investment banks had issued client advisories using language that would have been considered extreme just 48 hours earlier. One note, widely circulated, described the G7 institutional framework as having entered a period of structural uncertainty that warranted active repricing of assumptions embedded in long-term portfolio construction. A Deutsche Bank analyst wrote that American convening authority, the ability to gather allies and hold them, had been the invisible foundation of dollar-denominated global trade for 50 years. That foundation, she wrote, is now being visibly stress-tested for the first time. Domestically, the reactions split in ways that were predictable in direction, but alarming in scale. 3 senior members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee called for an emergency review of American multilateral engagement strategy without once mentioning the president's actions directly. In Washington's political language, that silence is not neutrality. It is the loudest possible signal that something has gone badly wrong, and no one in the room wants to be the one to say it first. It damages the operational predictability that global business depends on, and the cost of that damage will be measured in actual dollars over actual decades. So here is where things stand right now, 1 hour after the most extraordinary scene in the G7's 51-year history. The 6 leaders who signed that joint statement have scheduled a follow-up call within 48 hours. Officials in at least 3 of the participating countries have confirmed that the agenda for that call includes structural options for the future of multilateral economic coordination, options that range from reforming the G7's governance to prevent any single nation from claiming ownership of the institution, to expanding the group's membership to dilute the influence of any single member, to the option that sent the sharpest signal through Washington's foreign policy community, continuing as a G6 without the United States until American participation demonstrates a commitment to the foundational principles the institution was built on. That last option is being seriously discussed, not as a threat, as a contingency. The difference matters. A threat is designed to change behavior. A contingency is designed to survive if behavior does not change. Three of the six leaders are reportedly open to the G6 path if the next 30 days do not produce a meaningful shift in American conduct toward multilateral partners. The photograph from this morning has now appeared on the front page of major newspapers in every G7 country. It shows an empty circular table, six flags standing behind six absent chairs, and a single figure seated alone at the center. Editorial boards across three continents published responses within hours. The image was described by one historian of international relations as the most consequential photograph in multilateral diplomacy since the founding documents of the post-war international order were signed. Because that image does not capture a policy disagreement. It does not capture a trade dispute or a budget argument or a difference of opinion about climate targets. It captures something more fundamental. The question was, does American power determine who sits at this table? And five of the world's most consequential leaders answered it together in 3 minutes and 40 seconds by standing up and walking out the door. Through force or through legitimacy, the American-led post-war order was not built on force alone. It was built on a bargain. American leadership in exchange for American restraint within institutions that treated members as equals. Today, that bargain was openly discarded, and the five leaders who walked out were not rejecting American power. They were refusing a version of American power that had no room for the rules that make power legitimate. What comes next will depend on decisions made in the next 72 hours, in the next 30 days, and across the next several years. The G7, as it existed this morning, no longer exists in the same form. Whether a new form emerges, whether the institution is rebuilt on clearer and more protected principles, whether American leadership finds a way back to the table it just emptied, none of that is determined yet. What is determined is the image, the empty chairs, the corridor conversation, the six flags behind six absent leaders, the single figure sitting alone in a room designed for seven. That image is already permanent. It will be in the textbooks. It will be in the documentaries. It will be cited in every future discussion of what multilateral leadership requires and what happens when it is abandoned. He tried to remove one leader. He lost five. He tried to claim the table. He ended up sitting alone at it, and the world watched every second. Subscribe and stay close to this channel. We will be tracking the 48-hour emergency call between the six leaders the moment it concludes, and if the G6 option moves from discussion to formal proposal, we will break it down the moment that information is confirmed. This story is not over. It is, in every sense that matters, just beginning.